Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and following up on the president's presentation. As it was mentioned, there are several ministers here, transportation, energy, infrastructure, concessions, and so on and so forth. And it's going to be also a pleasure to see that your questions could also be directed to them. The basic message that I would like to convey and is one that this government is presenting a very wide set of reforms in Brazil, but with very, very specific focus. Basically, three focus. Number one, measures which aim at limiting the growth of expenses, public federal expenses mostly, and I will talk about state government expenses as well, but let's focus now on the federal ones. And second, this is going to be followed by actions which aim on the reduction of the debt directly. And third, increase of the level of productivity of the economy. Let's start with the control of expenses growth. That's critical. Why? Because the main reason why Brazil today is facing the kind of recession we are now enduring is a direct result of, number one, the exponential growth of the federal expenses and of the debt, public debt as a result. And in addition to that, problems related to transparency, what it was called in Brazil creative accounting, in the sense that markets began to lose the confidence that the numbers were real. Regardless of how much of that is the fact or not, the main point is that there was a drop in confidence. As a result of that, there was a drop in investment, and as a result of that, employment, growth, and so on and so forth. Then the main objective here is, number one, increase the transparency on the public accounts. And then the first action which was taken was to research and made a profound analysis that was the first economic act taken by this government to determine exactly the size of the primary surplus debt this year. It was published then, as the President mentioned, the precise number, which is going to be met, which means this number is a fact. It's exactly the best projection as possible made in last May. Second, to not only control expenses on an anecdotal or issue by issue, one account by another account, etc., but to set a ceiling on the growth of government expenses. And here is another important fact which explains how profound and important that reform is for Brazil today. I would like to emphasize this point and go somewhat deeper on that subject, which is the following. More than 75% of the total expenses in Brazil are defined by the Brazilian Constitution, which was approved in 1988. As a result of that, the total level of federal expenses as a percentage of the GDP has grown steadily throughout the whole period, every president of Brazil since 1991 left the level of total federal expenses as a percentage of the GDP higher than it was when he took over, or she took over. And that is one of the reasons why we decided to take the structural approach, which is proposing a constitutional amendment, which goes after the basic items, which were kind of items which could not be changed, but are very important that are addressed. Then we propose that there is a ceiling, there will be a ceiling for the growth of total federal expenses limited to the inflation of the previous year, which means that will be, in the longer run, a zero in growth, real growth rate of federal expenses in Brazil. The second important point is to make that viable. It's very important to reform the social security system in Brazil. As in most of the countries, particularly in the Western world, but not only, the social security in the long run, it's going to be proved not financiable by the society. But that is the opportunity now and the moment and the need in Brazil Brazil has a need and an opportunity to face this issue right now. Then the second basic reform, which is going to be presented to the Congress, is the Social Security reform. The first one was already proposed. It's going well, as the President mentioned. Then there are other issues which also have, measures which also have result on generation of revenues. Concessions, for instance, is one. Even privatization related to the profit overbook on the sale of assets. The end of the sovereign fund, which there is in Brazil. Why? There's no reason for Brazil to have a sovereign fund, as opposed to what it was expected at some point. The oil reserves in Brazil are not producing a sufficient amount of resources which would justify a sovereign fund, as the Gulf states or some countries like Chile with copper and so on and so forth. Then that is financed by debt, which means that makes no sense. We are extinguishing it at the end of the day. In summary, there are very, very, very concrete set of concrete steps being taken to really control the growth of government expenses, federal expenses in Brazil throughout the next years. It's called the new fiscal regime. And that, if approved, which we believe it will, the President has, as he mentioned, she is most likely the President of Brazil who has the most efficient and productive and close relationship with the Congress. He was the Speaker of the House 3 times. And then there is a strong level of confidence building up in the country already, not only in the government, that these reforms are going to be approved. And I do think that is a window of opportunity, a historical one for Brazil. Now, the second set of measures is actions which aim directly at the reduction of debt. For instance, the best example of that is the prepayment of loans which were made by Treasury to the Brazilian National Development Bank. And the fact is that that was an amount of money which is not justifiable by the demand for credit for the development bank for the next years. Then they are going to prepay actually the Treasury around 100 billion reais. Evidently, that is being analyzed and is subject to approval by the pertinent accounts court system which exists in Brazil which defines this kind of issue. And third, actions with a focus on, as I said, increase on the level of productivity of on the economy, and that is basically also composed of a set of projects. Some of them, most of them already under discussion at the Congress, like, for instance, the governance of state-owned companies. That's already approved. That's already signed by the president, which creates some rules for the appointment of managers and directors for state-owned companies, which is a professional experience, expertise, and so on and so forth, having no past problems, no political direct connections, and so on and so forth. This is more profound and more serious than one can think of. The ones who know Brazil better know how that important is, particularly as a result of the presence of the state-owned companies in the economy, which is substantial. And to say the least, a well-managed set of state-owned companies in Brazil will make, and it's going to make, are already making. Petrobras is an excellent example of that. Brazilian National Development Bank, or Banco do Brasil, or Caixa Econômica are excellent examples of the kind of difference, or Eletrobras, whatever, is a good example of how that is important and how fast the results are coming with strong, professional, and good management of the state-owned companies. In summary, my basic message is that it's not only one or two actions. The one, obviously, which gets more publicity, rightly so, because it's a very profound and serious one, and with very important consequence, is the so-called ceiling on growth of federal expenses. And that is a very important one. But what I am emphasizing here is that a very complete set of proposals, some of them already approved, which will, in our assessment, affect the productivity rate of Brazil at the end of the day and influence the potential growth rate of the country, and that will last for a long period in the sense that those reforms have long-term consequences for Brazil. To give an idea, the proposal for changing the Constitution in order to set the limit on expense growth is the first change in the Constitution since 1988, when it was approved, that addresses directly this question of expenses being determined by the Constitution. As I said, almost 80% of total expenses are determined by the Constitution. Then it's difficult, but viable. We are very confident that's going to be approved, particularly with the leadership of the president in that issue, which is very important politically and because of his leadership with the Congress. And I think that that is something that we will have. Evidently, it's a very serious issue. There are discussions, as it happens in democracy, which is a welcome one, and there is disagreement. There are concerns. There is opposition to that, which is fair. Good to have that in a democracy, but again, we think it's important, and we think that chances of approval are extremely, extremely high, and the market is already beginning to bet on that. When we see the level of confidence of business and consumers, we see that the level of confidence in the Brazilian economy is dropping since 2011, steadily. And that is very consistent with the drop on the GDP growth rate. Initially by the decrease of the GDP growth rate, and then by the recession. And the drop in confidence, particularly business confidence, is very parallel, if you see the curves, to the drop in GDP growth rate. And then there is a similar one with consumers, it's about the same. Both of them have already bottomed up and are beginning now to grow steadily and surely. And we have heard from you here in New York, and we already are following that before, but a confirmation here that markets are opening up for the first time. It's possible really to place bonds, Brazilian bonds in the market, which is very, very strong demand, and at that level of investment is growing in Brazil. Capital investment is increasing, foreign direct investment is increasing, and also credit and consumption is beginning now to grow. Why? Because the basic, not only the basic reason which led Brazil into that decline, which is of the GDP growth rate, is because, number one, there was a perception of not controlled increase on the expenses and as a result of the public debt. That is addressed, and the moment that that is approved, we can see for, again, as I mentioned, for the first time, indicates that total federal expenses are going to decrease as percentage of the GDP in Brazil. Not many countries are taking a step as bold and strong and hard as that. And I think Brazilian society now is understanding that it's a need to bring back growth and employment. And that is what really is on the interest of the average citizen. The way the process is evolving is a classic one by textbook. When you begin this kind of recovery, after you address the basic issues, initially there was a recovery on the price of assets, number one, in the market. Number two, a recovery of the confidence level. Then it followed by recovery of credit volume. Then the economy, consumption, and investment begins to grow. Then employment. And eventually, we can see the potential growth rate of the economy beginning to grow. And that series is being followed now clearly in the market. All the economic indicators are already showing that very clearly. I would like also to address some basic points of this proposal. One of them is the fact that now I am talking about the ceiling on the growth, is that it shows a sharp change. Let me only mention briefly some two basic numbers. From 1997 until 2015, the total expenses, federal expenses in Brazil have grown 6% above inflation on average for that period. From 2008 to 2015 alone, more than 50%. And with this proposal, it's zero growth rate. And since we expect to have, obviously, the GDP growing at positive rates, we will see a steady decline on that. And to give you an idea, if that proposal had been approved, this exact one in 2006, the total level of federal expenses as a percent of GDP would not be at 19% like today, but at 10%. And this is only to give you a dimension of the change. Evidently, there is a term. It's long enough to influence the profile of the debt and to change the predictability of the economic environment in Brazil, in the sense that that criteria, once approved, is going to be set for 10 years. And then the president at that time will propose and Congress approve any change in that criteria, but this regime, the new fiscal regime, will stay for 20 years. In summary, That is a very important point of this measure, which is to set a horizon which is long enough that would allow all of you to make your calculations and projections on your markets and Brazilian economy in Brazil. And another very important consequence, not only in terms of confidence, but the moment that the growth in the public debt starts to moderate and stabilize and then fall, evidently more savings in the society will be available for investment and consumption by the average citizen and by the private sector in general. In summary, it's a complete and profound change again in the way macroeconomic policy has been conducted in Brazil for decades. That is basically the summary of the kind of change we are proposing. The ministers who are here present, transportation, energy, infrastructure, the coordination of infrastructure, justice is also here. We would have the opportunity to answer questions in all these areas that you might have. In summary, thank you very much. And for the ones who are already in Brazil, we trust that you are already seeing these developments. I am seeing several of you confirming that with your heads, and some of you with smiles, meaning that things are already improving in Brazil. And second, the ones who are not yet there yet, I would advise you to take a close look in Brazil. And some of you have seen the presentations on the concessions, and there will be 30 ones that are going to be presented now. Some of you were present at the meetings about that issue, and I am sure that is also a very specific and important group of changes and investment opportunities. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to open it up for questions to Minister Meirelles or the other ministers. There are mics that will be circulating. Sure. Mic over here.
Yes. My name is Saul Sang from Brazil Agro. I would like to know what will be the policy for the foreign investment in lands in Brazil, having in mind that the important car maker want to buy the property and they couldn't do it to build a car factory and doing a big investment. I represent the agribusiness industry, and we are stopped in the last years to invest in Brazil because this limitation.
Okay. Well, I would ask which of the Brazilian ministers would like to ask this question. Minister Meirelles? You need a mic over here? Yeah, the mic.
What?
Yes, the question, let me repeat the question. If you would like to repeat your question.
The question, please?
Oh, the question. Yeah, the question is, when will foreigners be allowed to acquire land in Brazil? Because the gentleman was asking questions from the agribusiness, and this has been a major impediment to investment in Brazil. Yeah, in the motor car industry as well. Is it the motor car industry as well?
Yeah. This matter is being discussed with Congress, and our proposal is that it's allowed. We think that that's an opportunity also for international companies to invest in the agribusiness in Brazil. And again, as the discussions with the Congress, it's a democratic process, happily, and that takes some time, but at least when it's approved, it lasts with a longer time, or hopefully definitely, and with legal and institutional confidence, which means that there's something which is more solid.
We have time for, I'm told, we have time for one more question. So this is it's going once, it's very valuable, so better be a really good question. Okay. Sorry. So who's the person who asked the question? Okay, perfect.
Firstly, I wish to say thank you for the involvement of President Temer and the ministers in taking charge of what is a difficult situation in Brazil. As investors, I'm sure we're very grateful for that. The changes that are being proposed are absolutely essential to the financial health of Brazil, but with that will come a risk of social unrest and of problems. What are the plans that the government has to manage the potential social unrest of these plans that are in place, which will affect the pocket of every Brazilian?
The main reason for the social arrests which took place in 2013 and later were basically the beginning of the rise in unemployment and the rise in inflation and the loss of purchase power by the average citizen. Since now, we are see already the signals of economic growth, which means that would be followed in due time, but the recovery in employment, and that the central bank is addressing with credibility and with precision the inflation question in Brazil again. We seeing that, we believe that the basic reasons for the social unrest are being addressed, and the fact that some specific segments might protest, which is fair, it's a democracy, and we think that that's strengthened rather than creates a problem. It's normal. There are the sectors which are going to lose something, might not like it or complain, and voice their concern to the society and to Congress. And evidently, the question, the numbers which show the growth and expenses and everything we talked about here, on the other hand, we think have a stronger impact on the society as a whole. Why? Because at the end of the day, what matters for people is employment, is income, and to have the country growing and generating wealth for everyone.
Okay, well, I'd like a big round of applause for Minister Meirelles. Thank you all very much.